Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture of CC 111. Today's topic is static or class variable. In our last lecture, you have learned operator overloading and encapsulation. In today's lecture, we are going to learn about static variable, how to declare it, how we can access those variables, and how we can modify those. So what is basically an static variable, or what we can call a variable statics? So basically a variable is called static when it is defined inside a class but it is outside the method. It is also called class variable, and the static variables belongs to the class. They are independent to the objects. So let's see an example of an static variable so that you can understand what we are referring to. For understanding static variables, we must understand first there are two types of variables that we can define in our classes. One is instance variables and another is called static variables. Instance variables are those variables that are defined inside the method, or we can say inside a constructor. These are instant variables and that are usually referred with the self keyword or the reference of the object within its definition. And static variables are the variables that are outside the class, outside the method but inside the class. These static variables are shared by all the objects and they usually called using the class name. In this simple example, we have a definition of a very simple class where we have a constructor and some variables. So the first variable that we are seeing here is uni name equals to bracket. This variable is outside the method, however it is inside the class definition. So this type of variables are known as static variables or class variables. The variables that are defined in the constructor, the name, ID and department, are instance variables and they are referred with the keyword self or the reference of the object that we have referred here in the constructor. So self.name is equals to name. This is an instance variable. ID is also defined with the self.id. This is an instance variable. And lastly, the department is also another instance variables. So for differentiating static variables and instance variables, at first we have to look where the variables are defined. Okay, so let's see it in an example of how we can define static variables, how we can access it and update it. So let's go to the spider for demonstration. Okay, so let's define a basic class where I will show you some static variables and instance variables definition and how we can actually manipulate them. Let's define the class. Let's call it a student, and I'm going to define a constructor init here, which will have three variables on it as a parameter: name, ID and department. So let's define this. Self dot name equals to name. Similarly, the other variables, self dot id equals to id and self dot department equals to department. Okay, and I will have a print statement so that we can visualize this self dot name, um, some printing object created. Okay, so for our understanding purposes, I'm just printing this. Okay, and in this part I'm gonna create the objects so that we can visualize how these things work. Okay, I'm just making it a separate part so that you can see. Okay. So let's define the first object, st1 equals to student, and I have to pass the three parameters. Let's say name it Alice with ID something like this, and the department, let's say, is CSC. This is how our first object is created. The variables that I'm passing here using the keyword self dot something, or these variables that are defined inside the constructor, are known as instance variables. So here the name, the ID and department, all those variables are instance variables. Okay, these are dependent to the objects that I'm assigning to. So if I define another student, let's say st2, and I give them some different values, let's say something else. Okay, and I also change its department. So the name variable, the instance variable name, is different for st1 as well as is different for st2. So if we print the variables using their reference name, which is st1 or st2, and I want to print the department, for example, of st1, as well as I want to print the department from st2, and if I run it, I'll get different values, because these are instance variables which are depending on which object I'm generating the values. Okay, so that means if I changes the variables value from 1, let's say I change the value from x, y, z, the department of st1, if now I print the value of st2, it won't get affected. It will still be VBA. However, st1 department will be changed to CSC to XYZ. Okay, so these are called instance variables. We already know what are instance variables. Now, if we want to have some kind of properties or something that are independent to the objects, but it will require something like similar or same for all the objects, then we have to use the static or the class variable. Here, for example, let's say we have defined something like uniname. Okay, so let's say the variable name is uniname, and the value that I have set it is bracket. This uniname is something that is common for st1 and st2. So this shouldn't be dependent on the objects, even though we can see the values that the variable has. So let's print this. As this is independent to the objects, we should call it by the student class itself. So we should put a student dot uni name. Okay, so this should print us bracket. That means this static variable or the class variables are independent to the object. These are something general that is shared among all the objects. So this is known as a static variable or sometimes class variable. This is the same thing. So these variables can also be viewed as the value stored in st student. So st1.uni name, it should also print the same value, which is bracket. Okay, and for st2 it will print also bracket. So as we can see that this variable is common for all. That means if I change or I want to change the value, should I always reference to the class name dot the variable name, then the any kind of modification that I want to. And let's say I want to change the uni name from bracket to unknown. That should be changed in by using the class name dot uni name. Let's print the uni name for both objects. Okay, for st1 and st2 I have made a change here. So now initially it was bracket, so this statement should give me bracket. After modifying this, from this print statement I should get a student uni name as a bracket who instead unknown instead of bracket. So let's print this. Okay, so it's showing me unknown. So basically this is something that is kind of global, that is shared among all the objects. If one changes this, it will change in all the objects. Okay, so what can be the purpose of using this kind of variables, or what the purpose of having a static variables? So mainly we can use this variables in order to, for example, count the objects, or uh, or do something that are global for all, that everyone is going to use. That can be a name, for example, or that can be a counter value. Okay, so let's define another one, which is the student number. For example, initially I'm gonna set this to 0. After creating each object, I'm gonna increment the value to 1, so that we can actually have this static value here. So how we can do this? So basically we have to increment it here. Student num equal student num plus 1. Okay, so we have to increment it every time that we create an object. As this variable is for the class, we have to refer the class name here when we are incrementing. Otherwise it won't be treated like class variable. So what we have to do is just put the class name dot the variable name that we want to increment or we want to modify, and here I'm creating the counting the number of students. So what I do is student dot student name equals to student dot student name plus 1. Okay, let's print this. Before creating any objects, I'm gonna print here student dot student number. So initially, without creating any objects, I'm gonna comment this. Okay, let's remove this part. Okay, so if I run this, it's showing me 0. That means there is no students here. So let's create 2 objects here, and I'm gonna print the student numbers after creating each object. So initially I create st1, so this statement here will be incremented as 1. Okay, Alice object is created after creating the first object, and after creating the second object it shows us John objects created and the number of students is 2. So this is how we can use the static variables. Number of students. Okay, so to be more readable, I'm putting some comments. Okay, let's run it again. Okay, so number of students, initially it was 0. After Alice is created, the number of students is 1. And after John is created, number of students is 2. So we have to remember that static variables are kind of global variables that are shared among all the objects, independent to the objects is related to the class, and instance variables are the variables that are specific to the objects, that are dependent to the type of object that we are defining and what kind of values that are storing. Okay, so in our next lecture we will see static methods or types of method in Python, such as class method, static method, as well as we will have a recap of instance methods. Thank you.